So the first, let's say learning moment of today is going to be a panel with two of our speakers here in front of us, with Ovidiu Cical and Matt Jarvis. I'm going to tell you just a few information about them, just a little bit of information. You're going to find out more from them, but probably you already know. Matt is a Senior Director of Community and Evangelism at Mesosphere. You probably know about them if you're here today. Matt spent more than 15 years building products and services around open source software on everything from embedded devices to large-scale distributed systems. Most recently, he has been focused on the open cloud infrastructure space and in emerging patterns for cloud-native applications. Actually, the theme for the panel you're going to be involved in is big data in 2020, or maybe if we ask Miss Dăncilă, 2020. It's going to talk about infrastructure and challenges for big data in the near future, okay? And here in front of me with Matt is also going to be Ovidiu. And what I can tell you about Ovidiu is that he's a dedicated development manager and software architect for DLP and MDM products. And he is also the software architect of sensitivity.io. I hope I said that well. Okay. As I said, I'm not a technical person, but I'm a person that has been working with people for a lot of years now. And what I am here today for is to make sure that you learn and your time is well spent, okay? So this is my focus for today. And I'm going to invite in front here with me, Matt and Ovidiu, so that we can start the panel. Let's give them a big round of applause. Do you have a headset?
No.
Maybe you should get one. Okay. Take a seat, please. Yeah. The way we thought about this panel to work is going to be like this. I'm going to let them offer a preview, a perspective, the way they see things first, like make an introduction each about big data, 2020, infrastructure challenges, what they want to tell you about it. Afterwards, when they're finished with their view upon the subject, I'm going to ask some questions and I'm going to invite you also to participate in order for us to have a meaningful talk together, okay? So, which of you wants to begin?
After you, sir.
The guest here in Romania.
Okay. Then
Okay.
it's going to be Matt.
Well, I guess as we were talking about before the show started, this whole field really, if we go back 5 or 6 years, was pretty incredibly specialized and very difficult to work in. And I think what's been really transformational to see over that time period is how the kinds of people who want to do big data, machine learning, analytics has really widened out to be almost everybody now. Almost every business needs to be data driven and try and get value out of analytics. And so I think we're going to see some really big challenges moving forward in the next 5 or 6 years as that thing starts to accelerate. I mean, clearly it's still really difficult to build this kind of stuff, to operate it, and to program for it. And I think that's going to be one of the interesting things to watch.
We, on the other hand, working on a product company, we are on the other side of where Matt is. So we are the ones that use the tools that his company and other companies developing big data processing power or infrastructure. We are the ones using it. And we noticed in the last years, we noticed a shift on how the data is being acquired and processed. Our customers are very okay with us collecting the data, but generally they don't want us to either process it or make sense out of it. They wanna use tools. They wanna use real big, powerful infrastructure to predict based on the data they acquire. So for that, you need a good flow for the information. I really think that information should be more than simple data, that it's just going from A to B, or also going through some process and some other tools that make sense of it. Data should have power by itself. From my point of view, us as software developers need to empower the data, give it some brain, so that at the end you start with a purpose for it. So you don't just collect it and maybe you make something out of it. You start with a purpose, and this way you can have better results.
Okay, I do have a question in mind for them, but I want to know if you have a question first. If any of you already have a question in mind. Okay, then I'll go first, and whenever you have something any kind of input, please let me know by a sign of any kind. I don't want it to be like in school that you have to get your hands up, but just make a sign of any kind that you want to say anything, okay? So my question to you guys is, what do you think are the biggest fears people have regarding big data in the near future? What do you think they fear most? And when I say people, I mean from both perspectives. People who don't really know what it means and people who work with it. What do you think their biggest fears are?
Do you mean in the sense of companies or individuals?
In the sense of companies.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that unless you can, in an awful lot of industries now, unless you can transform your business into being data-driven and to understand the complexities of your business through looking at the numbers, you're really leaving yourself open to having your lunch eaten by data-driven disruptors like Amazon. And we see that already in a lot of industries in the US, that those kinds of companies now have so much data and so much analytical power that it's very easy for them to enter traditional industries and disrupt them. So I would say that's probably a key concern for a lot of businesses. But I mean, to Ovidiu's point about how much the kind of approach at the minute is very much let's collect everything and then try and work out afterwards what we need to do to it. And this is basically because compute and storage have become so cheap, right? That was the big barrier to being able to take that approach before. But you're right. I think that you have to have some kind of a vision of what that data can do for you. And I mean, to some extent, that was kind of what I was getting at in my opening remarks, is that it's still really complex to understand what it is that you want to do with data. And I think really, as we see big data and machine learning and those kind of things spread out more into the mainstream, we need to find some way of simplifying that. And whether that is some kind of standardization of data on an incoming flow, or inference systems that can actually start doing things automatically to that data, because the programming models are still super complicated, for true democratization of those technologies.
Yes, you're right here, but from my perspective, and the way I see it different is because you yourself with Mesosphere, you got to know customers and the companies that have amounts of data, probably unused data, to work on at some point, which is okay if and only if they make sure the data they have is properly protected. And I think this is the biggest fear of all when it comes to data, how a company protects the data that it stores, and not just from outside threats. Also, internal threats are very, very bad to have, and they happen. They happen more than the external factors. And they happen by mistake, or they happen by intention. I mean, like bad actors inside the companies. But if you make sure you have the data, then you have proper layers of security on the data you store. and manage and manipulate, you can guarantee that the data is going to be safe even if it leaves the perimeter. Another important thing I noticed is that companies are doing something for this. I mean, like, I got to know companies, and I know that they are trying to protect the data. They are hiring consultants. They are making sure the data gets stored with some level of encryptions, or at least it's stored where people don't have access easy to it. Another fear is how I see another fear, but from a people perspective, not just as a company, if I may. People also have no clue where the data goes, their personal data goes, and how it's stored and processed. Okay, now there are all kinds of regulations like the ones we are experiencing right now in Europe with GDPR, which is going to be in effect on 25th of May. And now people are starting to see that there is data collected about them. It goes to those companies, and the simple fact that these companies now have to request access or request permission to store and process that data makes it a little bit more transparent. But this thing was unknown up until this. Well, so this is a fear for me.
I think people are just starting to realize the power of inference, right? I mean, I don't think any of us could have really looked forward, even 5 or 6 years ago and seen the kind of impacts that Facebook data could have had on elections, and just that power of little nudges in a completely surprising way. And I guess that's one of the things that Google and Amazon and that set of companies realized that very early on, that data was power, right? And there's a very famous quote saying data is the new oil. And I think it's taken a long time for the broad spectrum of businesses to really understand that, and for some of them they've just come to that understanding too late, right? The book industry did, all of the other industries that have already been disrupted and already gone, the taxi industry in most parts of the world, have just come to that realization too late. So I think to come back to Anna's point about fear, I guess people have already got these big examples of how easily industries that were old and established can be disrupted and disappear in a second. You only need to look at the list of big US companies who just no longer exist. Barnes and Noble, there's tons of them, right? And they've ceased to exist because they didn't understand the power of data.
Thank you, guys. Before I move to any of my other questions, because I have a lot of questions in mind, can you hear us well? Are you able to? It's okay for you? Okay. Thank you for the nodding and the feedback. Do you have any fears of your own? Do you have any thoughts on this subject of people and the fears they have regarding big data? Do you want to add anything or ask these guys anything at this point? No? Okay. Then my next question would be, let's make an imagination exercise. And, Matt said something interesting, like, who would have imagined 5 or 6 years ago the scandal Facebook would be in right now? Let's see, what kind of scandals or what kind of issues, let's not say scandals, do you think we are not able to imagine now, but might be very real in like 10 years from now? How do you see the future regarding data? How do you see, what issues do you see that the common persons, not only companies, common people will actually feel or be part of, or say, oh my God, I couldn't have imagined this 10 years ago?
I think those are almost certainly around the artificial intelligence field, and that's moving so quickly now that I think it's going to be pretty hard for even those of us in the industry to imagine what's going to be possible in terms of, to that point about making inferences and us not necessarily needing to program models anymore, because we already have AI models that can do those things. I mean, there was a demonstration that Google did last week, I think, of at one of the Google conferences in the US, of the Google Assistant actually making phone calls on behalf of somebody. And I mean, I think you can watch that, especially if you're not involved in the field, and I don't think you grasp quite how groundbreaking that is, and what's actually happening there in the background. And that's really a massive step forward, and I think we're going to see more and more of those. As I mean, certainly even a couple of years ago, you would have said that was a very, very difficult problem to crack. There's so many layers involved in picking apart what's actually happening there from a computational perspective. So I think a lot of these things are going to come from that space, and they'll be surprising ones, because perhaps AI models can infer things about data that even a data scientist can't necessarily infer, because they can test so many hypotheses on at scale very, very quickly that it's very hard for humans to be able to do. So I think that's going to be one of the spaces.
You're right, and I'm pretty sure almost everybody in this room saw the video of that call, which was quite frightening at some point. But indeed, the level of AI is increasing, and they have the most amount of data to work with. So I think those are probably tens of years of training, computer training on the data, and model it in the way they want. And one of the things that comes to my mind when I think about this is, at some point, like our colleague said, the free will start to fade. We will be driven by data, and I think we already are driven by data. So in 5 to 10 years, I'm afraid we won't have our own decisions when it comes to product, when it comes to services, picking up maybe even the right bed for your kid. It's not going to be your decision based on what you feel, but based on what others made you feel. But
I mean, I guess that's one of the, that's quite a negative outcome, right? And you could certainly go down that route. I mean, you could ask the question whether we, when you look at psychological theories like nudge and stuff, whether we ever had free will over things, right? But, I mean, it's, I think the challenge will be making sure that as human beings, and not just, I mean that not just as companies or industry professionals, but that as human beings, we all have access to those technologies. So those technologies aren't just being used to influence us, but we have access to them in some way in order to make sure that's a two-way street.
I'm following the AI space quite a lot, and I'm trying to read as much as possible. And what I noticed as a negative part is that the ethics about all of this is not so well handled as it is the progress. So rarely you can see reports or analytics about or ethics imposed to the way companies are developing AI models. So, I don't know, maybe in 5 to 10 years, there will pop up lots of jobs for making sure the AI companies,
ethical, yeah.
They won't step over the line for how they implement the systems. So that can be a good job in the future.
I think you're right. I think that's an interesting point, because certainly, the Facebook thing, I think, has opened a lot of people's eyes about what has actually happened within those companies, and the kind of approaches that whether or not that was taken cynically, or whether it was purely a scientific thing of, well, we can do that, so let's do it. But yeah, I think you're right that we may see jobs actually come up that are about data ethics, and that for your company to be successful, you will hopefully need to be seen as being ethical with that data.
As the guy spoke about AI, I don't know if you know, but last week there's been this conference in Bucharest, Brand Minds, maybe you know about it, especially dedicated to marketing people and people dealing with marketing field. And one of the I was going to say persons, but it's not a person. One of the appearances on scene was Sophia, yes, the AI, the famous AI. And a thing that I remembered, and I think it's fascinating, is that people got to ask Sophia questions, people from the room. And one of the questions was, Sophia, in your opinion, do you think it's valid for us people to be afraid of artificial intelligence, to be afraid that one day robots might harm us or might do something bad to the humanity? And actually the answer was mind-blowing, coming from Sophia. She said, you know, I think you should raise your robots like you raise your children. What you give in, you'll get out. That was her answer. And I actually had goosebumps. I still have goosebumps thinking about the fact that an AI could have given such an answer, such a deep, profound answer, and something for all of us, I think, to think about, because there is some truth in that, actually. So this leads me to the following point of the discussion. How do we prepare for that? What do we give in for us to get out good results? And maybe you guys could tell us about the companies you work in. What do you put in order to take good things out of big data?
That's a great question. I think there were two, sorry.
It's okay.
I think there were 2 points there. If I understood your question correctly. One of them was about how do you get good results with this stuff, and you know, it's clearly a pretty complex field at the minute. I mean, you know, to deploy this kind of technology and to use it is, you know, involves multiple distributed systems and is hard to operate and hard to program for. But you know, there are lots of systems like the company I work for, Mesosphere, who make that a lot simpler. But I kind of think, you know, the next stage for this is like, you know, someone is going to invent the spreadsheet of machine learning or the spreadsheet of analytics. You know, something that was the spreadsheet, when the spreadsheet was invented, it was really transformational for access to being able to do complex business mathematics. And, you know, it'd be nice to think that there is, you know, I haven't got the answer to this, but that there would be a kind of simplified model somehow that makes it super easy to access the results. Because most businesses, there's no business value in, you know, operating complex systems. You know, what are most businesses interested in? They're actually interested in the results at the end. That's the only bit that has any business value. So I guess, you know, for me, what I'm really interested in is that kind of science fiction Minority Report style, you know, utility computing, where I just throw some data in there and, you know, the system magically knows what I need to, what I'm looking for at the end of it. But, you know, that doesn't exist right now. So.
I'm interested if you can, I don't know, maybe share one of your customers. You have quite some names under Mesosphere. And I suppose they are making sense of the data, also using your approach, I mean, your processing infrastructure, which you provide with your products. So can you give us an example, and then I'm gonna give you mine.
Yeah, I'm not sure whose names I'm allowed to say on stage, but I mean
they are listed on the website.
Yeah, so I mean I can talk in more general terms about, you know, there's one of the world's biggest car manufacturers doing self-driving and semi-autonomous cars, and that's a really interesting problem from a data perspective. You know, there were some Google figures that predict that, you know, autonomous cars on the road might be generating 500 or 600 gigabytes of data a day. You know, and that is data that needs to have very fast return paths as well in terms of being able to do analysis and come back to the vehicle, in almost real time. So it throws up a whole interesting set of problem spaces about networks and about analytics, and those kind of stacks are typically built on things like Spark, like Kafka, these tools that are pretty familiar to most of us, right? You're working in this industry. Nobody's using any special source, and I think this is one of the things that is good at the minute, is that there's a very rich ecosystem of open source tools available to us to do this kind of work. I mean, yeah, they're complex to operate. When we look at something like TensorFlow, it's complex to scale and all the rest of it, but at least we've got it, right? If we go back 5 or 6 years, a lot of the tools that you would need to do that, you'd actually have to have written them yourself, and there's not many organizations who have those kind of resources available to them. So I think that's very optimistic for all of us, is that there's a rich ecosystem available to us, and that, there are proof points of people doing this kind of stuff at scale and being able to extract useful value. Does that answer your question? That felt like it was a bit of a rambling one.
No, it's okay. It's fair. We are on a smaller scale, to be honest, and on how we process the data. We are still implementing processing systems like Kafka, even storages which are distributed is not something we usually do. We are still working on this side. But like I said at the beginning, our customers, they want to get more from the data. So we collect data, we throw it in the system, and just charts and some metrics doesn't work anymore. They need that data to have a purpose, and most of them are using what they are called CM solutions, where they get instantly notified if data goes haywire, or they get alert if spikes occurs in certain areas of the business. So even our products, when they collect data about, transferred files, one of the products we developed is creating copies of the files that you try to get out of a company or upload to a certain storage service. They need those CM solutions, they need those even Mesosphere installations to tell them the data is acting weird, let's say. For them, that's important. So it's important for them to collect the data, to be able to have it, and to secure it, that's a different story, like I said earlier.
Guys, you come from different companies yourselves, so does anyone want to share an opinion on this? What you do differently, what your company does differently? Or maybe you want to use the chance to actually ask these guys something more specific, more technical than maybe I would have thought of. Okay, so please.
Hi. I'm curious, Matt, can you give an example of the largest cluster that you guys are running in terms of maybe resources or data that's being processed?
Yeah, well, I mean, probably some of the largest clusters are probably at Twitter, and they're certainly in the multiple tens of thousands of nodes. But everybody's doing different things, right? I mean, those very big web scale folks are doing their own particular thing, and that may not be about pure analytics workloads. That's often just about microservices and that kind of stuff. I think the most common pattern that we probably see outside of those big web scale users is the kind of Spark, Kafka, Cassandra type things, those sort of pipeline analytics workloads. Clearly Mesos is really about running very big clusters, but there's also a lot of people in our community who are running clusters of 20 or 30 nodes.
Yeah. We use Apache Mesos as
right,
well.
Okay.
Yeah. And Ovidiu, a question for you. A lot of companies are dabbling in AI and big data, biggest players being Google and Facebook and Twitter. And these companies do get revenue out of those products. do you have anything that generates revenue that is in the big data or AI field?
Not at this point, but I think we need to adapt. Otherwise, companies we're going to go for buying solutions that can do that for them. I'm going to have a speech later about APIs in general, focusing on the cybersecurity APIs. But I can tell you that we have customers that are buying other solutions to process or to get the AI out of the data we provide. So no, we don't have this as a selling model at this point.
Okay. We have another question there, and I'm happy about it.
Yes, hi. I just want to ask you, what about quantum computing, and how do you think quantum computing will influence big data and AI in the nearest future? We know we have in the whole world about 150 quantum computing, and maybe you can tell us more because
well, I mean,
should be used.
to be honest, I think, this is slightly tangential to what we're discussing here, but I guess it's kind of relevant that quantum computing is one of the very large paradigm architectural changes that we're on the verge of, right? Some of the other ones are things like memory speed storage access that kind of change the whole notion of what computing is, right? And I mean, to your point about quantum, I don't think really anybody particularly knows what the impact of that will be on a specific field. But I mean, clearly that's a game changer for everything, because for a start, every encryption key in the world is instantly broken. So I think probably to cycle back to the original question about what its impact's going to be on big data, I would say that we'll have bigger things to worry about than big data if quantum actually gets to that stage. I mean, I fully expect to see that within my lifetime, but then there's been other things that I've expected to see before now, right? That haven't happened, and yeah, it'll be interesting to watch.
Give us an example of things you have expected but haven't seen.
Well, so I mean, the memory class storage bit, which for those of you who haven't come across that's when sort of the next phase of storage architectures where you can access the storage as fast as you can access DRAM. And that when you start to think about what that means, our whole architecture of how computers are built and how processors are built now basically accept that your storage is super slow compared to your processor. So storage is always this idea of a bucket, this analogy of a bucket where you store things in, and then you have to bring it back into memory in order to operate on it. But once your storage is as fast as your memory, that kind of changes what the idea of storage versus compute actually is, and those two things end up much closer together, and it kind of breaks that processor architecture. And I've expected to see that for at least the last 10 years, and nobody's really, I think it's just starting to happen now, but that hasn't happened so far.
So, can you hear me? Okay. I was curious, we don't do quantum computing, and I don't think we will ever do on the products we are working now, but probably you guys already have some thoughts about it. And is Mesosphere going to try to adapt to that? I mean, at the point those are going to be general available, and you can buy with no more than a few millions one of those units.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, these things are paradigm changes, right? So it's hard to see, something like that, or a fully functioning advanced AI, those are clearly, you know, singularity type stuff where it has such a transformational effect on all of society that it's hard to predict what would happen. I mean, you know, one route is the, you know, the destruction of the human race, isn't it, right? But, you know, I mean, just in the quantum thing, if all key encryption is instantly broken, then where does that leave us in terms of our entire model for how we interact with each other, how we do banking, how we do commerce, how we do any of that? So I think it's a super difficult thing to say how would a company adapt to that, because, you know, I'm kind of not sure you could.
Well,
you know, I think it's
you are in this space. I mean, you are.
Yeah. I mean,
expected to do so, I think, at some point, right?
Quantum's a weird one, right? Though, because there's, you know, there's a lot of disagreement about whether things are actually quantum or not, even in a quantum field, at least how I understand it. And I'm not a theoretical physicist, by the way. So, yeah, I think there's some things that are real game changers, and I'll be interested to see, you know, what happens. Although I may have to go and live on an island somewhere and. In a bunker.
That's for 2025, probably.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions, guys, at this moment? Okay, we have another one there.
Is it about the robot apocalypse?
Thanks. On a more tangible note, do you see in the near future the blockchain technology crossing path with datafication, with big data?
So I think the question was, do we see blockchain as having an impact on?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, you know, I'm a big believer in blockchain and a holder of cryptocurrency, do I see it having an impact on big data specifically? I see it having a big impact on us as a society. You know, at what point that will happen, I don't know. You know, verifiable transactions are super important, right? I mean, that's, you know, kind of at the heart of a lot of how we interact as a society right now, and that's going to become more important. So, yeah, I guess I do. You know, I mean, when you look at some of the use cases, you know, there's clearly a lot of stuff going on particularly in crypto at the minute that's nuts, right? I mean, a lot of these ICOs are just complete junk; they're not worth anything. But when you look at some of the real transformational applications of blockchain, and you know, one of them's the thing about land contracts, right? Which is currently this incredibly you know, complex, paper-heavy, you know, difficult to understand kind of field that's just full of lawyers. You could see how that's a transformational thing, and I think the combination of blockchain plus some of the advances in AI, you know, like we talked about earlier, you know, I think some of the industries that are rife for disruption are actually things that have been fairly high up the food chain, right? I mean, if we look at a lot of the legal profession is basically sending letters and reading bits of paper. Well, that's clearly something that a suitably advanced AI can do very easily. It can't do it right now, but you could see how instantly almost that entire sector could cease to exist, and that's a highly paid sector right now, right? So I think in things like that, where you've got those particular sets of requirements for verifiable stuff, plus stuff that's very repetitive and paper heavy. Yes, I think it's definitely going to be a transformational thing.
For me, and in the area where I work, security, it's kind of weird that no company at this point has developed a blockchain technology that you can assure security for, I don't know, at least some of the critical infrastructure you have, like fingerprinting files on this scale in a blockchain, so that more people can make sure data is unaltered or files and programs are unaltered. So I'm expecting to see a company that will develop a technology like the ones with Filecoin that will be applied to security, and definitely it's going to disrupt this security market at some point, somewhere probably in the years you're talking about. Because there's none. At some point, Symantec tried something, but they ditched it. So somebody else will develop the proper technology to make security better by using blockchains from all the people.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody? I'd like to tackle a subject as we're reaching the end of the panel. You know, I think it's interesting to maybe find out from Matt. He's coming from a whole different environment, and I'm thinking not only company-wise, but country-wise and government-wise. And I think it's interesting to see, we know how it is to work in this environment, and I'm wondering how much of the big data issues that companies are dealing with, how much of it it's global, like if you take a company from Romania and you take a company from the US or from the UK, the issues are similar, and how much is different regarding the country you live in, the government, the laws. How do those impact, and how can we work with that?
So I think, well, I'm constantly surprised that, you know, I would say 99% of the world actually has no idea what they're doing. And that's the same in whatever country you are, right? And that's the same even with very large companies who you would make an assumption that they're super smart and know what they're talking about. You know, the amount of people who really do know what they're talking about in these kind of fields is a tiny sliver on top. So, you know, even big multinational banks, international car companies, you know, everybody is learning and is relatively at the beginning of this journey, right? And I know there's some, you know, there's some super smart companies, you know, in this country who are, you know, doing as cutting edge work as, you know, anybody else anywhere else in Europe or in America is. You know, there's a lot of companies who are throwing a lot of money into this space and, you know, hiring a lot of contractors, but they're starting from a position where they just throw money and hope something happens. And, you know, that's kind of not how you solve problems like this, I don't think. You know, there is a certain amount of investment, particularly if you have to do things at scale. I mean, compute's expensive, but, you know, throwing money at the problem space is, you know, it requires smart people. And, you know, there's a ton of smart people in Romania, right? I mean, you know, that's what I've been super impressed with every time I've been here.
I'm curious if two of the sectors that I think define somehow the UK as I think they invented most of it, and that's banking, fintech, and insurances. How is that evolving, or is any disruption, big disruption, in your countries regarding this, or it's pretty much the same like it was?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the industries that's on the verge of major disruption, right? I mean, you know, yes, banking. If anybody who's ever worked with most banks, a lot of banks, even very large ones, have systems that are completely antiquated. They rely on, you know, overnight text file transfers and crazy stuff that, you know, people came up with in 1965, and they can't touch it in case it breaks. And everyone has the root password for everything, and, you know, just crazy stuff. And, you know, you've got a lot of new agile entrants into that space, and, you know, that's very much the case in the UK, and it's the case in the US. I think a lot of the US banks are realizing the danger and are trying to transform. But, you know, transforming big legacy organizations is hard, right? I mean, you know, and I mean, this kind of cuts to the heart of, we can talk about technology all day, but really, you know, the hardest bit of any organization to change is people. And, you know, that's the biggest problem in technology generally is people. So in some ways, big entrenched organizations with, you know, with a lot of overhead and a lot of legacy are the more difficult to change. Yeah, I think I went around the houses a bit there, but I think that probably answers your point. But yeah, I mean, you know, the UK, we've got a couple of new entrants into that field. You know, they're like 20, 30 engineers. They're all about mobile, all about real time, and, you know, they have no legacy. So, you know, that's there's always that bit, you know, when you look at industries that are ripe for disruption, is always when you don't quite realize until somebody else comes along what an awful user experience that was, right? And I mean, you know, Uber did it with taxis, whatever the stuff about Uber treating their drivers. You know, once you went in an Uber, you're like, well, why have I been doing this whole taxi thing for the last like 30 years like this? Because like, this is just so much easier. You know, I don't have to carry cash and it's super easy and I can see where it is on my phone. And when you see some of these new banks, that's exactly it. You go, wow, like my experience with my bank has been awful for like 40 years. Why do I give them my money? So I think that's always a good yardstick, is where you can look at a new entrant into that market and say, wow, I'd forgotten my experience actually was really shitty before now. And like, you know, I think that's when, you know, to come back to that, what we talked about earlier about fear, that's when, you know, as a company, you should be frightened, is when you've, you know, it's pretty clear that you've got a crappy user experience.
Thank you.
Thank you also. This is all from me. If anybody else wants to add any questions, we're approaching the end of the panel, and this is the moment. If not, maybe you're gonna stalk one of them during lunch break or coffee breaks and ask one-on-one questions. Okay, we have more from Andrei.
You mentioned the topic of people being the biggest problem. Any other obstacles you see, the biggest ones in this field, big data and AI?
In terms of implementing these kind of changes within an organization, you mean? Yeah, well, I mean, you know, this comes back to the point I was trying to make at the start. You know, the tools are complex. You know, almost every modern application architecture to do this kind of work now involves multiple distributed systems. Each of those is complex to operate. It's complex to scale. It's complex to upgrade, and none of that stuff adds any business value to you, right? Because in almost every case, your only business value is the output. So, you know, you're going to spend a lot of time, you know, you could put all that stuff in a cloud platform and Google will do all that for you, but lots of people can't do that, right? Because of, you know, data regulation or privacy or whatever. And so, you know, you have to do that yourself. And, you know, at the minute, it's still super complex. And then that's before you even get to the programming side of it, right? You know, you've got to be a data scientist to understand this stuff. Well, not everyone can be a data scientist. So that was my point about the spreadsheet of, you know, of machine learning. You know, I want to just throw some stuff and drag some stuff and, you know, anybody can do it. But we're a long way away from that, a long way away. And machine learning's the same, you know. You need to build these super complicated pipeline things with a bunch of different tools, and it's great that we've got those tools, right? You know, if the industry had gone in a different direction than open source, we wouldn't have had access to any of that stuff except by buying it from somebody. So that's good, but you know, the flip side of it, it's still super complicated.